Paul stood before the assembly in Rome. His fingers traced the rough texture of the parchment, marking the lines that defined a new reality. He spoke of a divide, a vast chasm of guilt that had once severed humanity from its creator. The room went silent as he painted the scene of a traveler lost in the heart of a violent gale. Rain lashed against the man, wind tore at his balance, and every step was a struggle against an unforgiving landscape. He moved forward only through sheer painful endurance, fighting the elements for every inch of progress. Then, the path changed. The traveler crested the final ridge and stepped out of the storm. The wind died instantly. The mud gave way to firm, dry stone. He stopped, his breathing ragged, and realized for the first time that he did not have to fight the ground beneath him. He was no longer a target of the tempest, but a person standing on solid, unmoving earth. Paul looked up, his voice steady. "This," he said, "is the peace of reconciliation. The hostility is over. The struggle has reached its end." Paul shifted his weight, his eyes scanning the faces of those listening. He pressed his palm flat against the wood of the lectern. The peace he spoke of was not a temporary truce, he explained. It was a change in the very terrain of their lives. He asked them to consider the instinct to climb, to reach, to prove worth through daily effort. That was the old way. Grace, he declared, was the floor beneath their feet. It was the solid stone that held them up before they ever took a single step. He paced the small stage, illustrating how the weight of past failures had been lifted, leaving them standing in an entirely new territory. There was no need to perform for acceptance, when acceptance was the ground they stood upon. This realization shifted the air in the room. It replaced the frantic energy of the climber with the steady confidence of the traveler who had finally arrived. This was not the nervous gamble of a man hoping for a win. It was a quiet, unshakable expectation. They were anchored now. The striving had ceased, and in its place, a new, resilient hope began to take root, rooted in something far deeper than their own hands could ever build. Paul stopped his pacing and lowered his voice, the room tightening as he introduced a jarring paradox. He spoke of the furnace. He asked his listeners to picture a blacksmith standing in the dim light of a workshop. The iron is pulled from the shadows, raw and jagged. It is shoved into the heart of the fire until the metal turns a violent, glowing white. The heat is absolute. It does not soothe. It consumes the impurities held deep within the grain of the iron. Then comes the hammer. It strikes with heavy, measured force, echoing against the stone walls. Each impact is a shock, a jarring collision that forces the metal to surrender its old, brittle shape. Paul gestured with his hands, mimicking the rhythm of the forge. "This is not destruction," he insisted. "It is the precise, calculated work of refinement. The fire is searing, the hammer is relentless, yet they are the only tools capable of turning raw, useless ore into something resilient and sharp." He leaned forward, letting the image of the scorching heat hang in the air. The transition is not gentle. It is a process of fire and strike, of heat and pressure, designed to strip away everything that cannot withstand the test of the flame. Paul pulled his hands back, the intensity of the forge still lingering in his posture. He traced the logical arc of the fire. Suffering leads to endurance, endurance to character, and character to a hope that does not wither. He stood still, letting the silence of the room stretch. Then he shattered the expectation of merit. He spoke of a debt paid long before the debtor knew they were in the red. Christ did not wait for the iron to be refined. He did not wait for the impurities to be burned away. He died while his people were still lost, still hostile, still broken. Paul clenched his fist and opened it, a simple gesture of release. This was not a reward for their goodness. It was an act of raw, unearned initiative. The love of God was not a distant concept. It was a flood poured directly into the human heart. It was the fuel that turned the furnace of trial into a forge of purpose. For the first time, the listeners saw the math of their own lives rewritten. They were not waiting for the fire to stop to feel loved. They realized the love was the fire itself, burning away the old self to make room for a life that was finally, truly, anchored in something that could never be broken. Paul stepped forward, his eyes sweeping across the assembly. He drew a final, stark comparison to resolve the journey. He spoke of Adam, whose legacy was a long, cold shadow of death cast over every human life. It was a weight that had settled into the very foundation of history. But then, he spoke of the arrival of Christ. This was not a whisper. It was a surge of life that broke into that same story with the force of a dam wall collapsing. He clapped his hands once, the sound sharp in the quiet room. The era of striving to earn acceptance was over. He described the new reality, a total reconstruction. It was like dropping a heavy burden after miles of uphill climbing. The believer was no longer defined by the struggle to prove their worth. They stood in a new territory, resting on the floor of grace. Every hardship, every trial, every moment of life was now a crucible for growth. Paul lowered his hands, his posture open and steady. The cycle of guilt had been dismantled. In its place stood a life anchored in an enduring, expansive grace that required nothing but the act of receiving. He left the thought hanging in the air, a final invitation to live within that finished work.